Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale. Non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire. Non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli. Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale. Non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire. Non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli.
C'era. Parfait. Merci. Attends-moi, aide-moi pour monter. Merci, c'est parfait. Je vous remercie.
La civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session. The title is Looking at Reality, Embracing Meaning. I would like to welcome our two guests. First of all, Professor Vincent Carraud.
Professore.
He's full professor of philosophy at the Sorbonne in Paris. It's the first time for him at the meeting, so thank you so much for being here with us. And then Professor Costantino Esposito, full professor of history of philosophy at the University of Bari.
Quest'anno
This year is the 400th anniversary from the birth of Pascal, who is one of the main contemporary interpreters. And recently, Pope Francis wrote an apostolic letter dedicated to Pascal, in which he defines him as a tireless seeker of truth, and as such, always remains restless. I believe that the issue of sense is the most important challenge in our life. All the more today, when it seems that the seek for truth seems to be even impossible or extinguished. For some, it is really a dramatic reduction of modernity. For others, it is an advantage that is being over the truth. This evening, we would like to talk with you about the truth as the ultimate sense of the self and through your own experience. So I have my first question for Professor Carraud. What is this search in your view? And what can you tell us about your friendship with Pascal? Well, first of all, apologize for speaking French, as I can't speak Italian. My relationship with Pascal is linked to philosophy of the 17th century, and in particular, it's linked to the relationship between Descartes and Pascal. Heidegger, in the 20th century, affirmed that Pascal saved Christianity in the philosophy of Descartes, and on the other hand, he also says that it saved Descartesism in Christianity. And this initial question really called my attention. And Father Giussani, for example, talking about heart, refers to Pascal, even if he doesn't quote Pascal that much, but he has a concept of heart that is very similar to the one used by Pascal. May I dwell on the concept of heart? Of course, please. The concept of heart in Father Giussani, as much as in Pascal, evokes a number of suggestions. That is, it concerns the knowledge of fundamental principles. Pascal states that the heart is the element that perceives time and space, and says that even God is sensitive to the heart. So up until Descartes, the heart was the organ of passions. And in the passions of the soul, Descartes says that the location of passion is not in the heart. So from Aristotle to Descartes, the idea was that the heart was the house of passion, but with Descartes, it is not the case. It's just a muscle. So with Descartes, a new era opens up in which the heart is used in a metaphorical way, and Pascal, as much as Father Giussani, refers to it in a metaphorical way. And this is a fundamental point, because for us, the heart, and for Pascal, it determines sensitivity that is not sensitive and not sentimental. When one says that God is sensitive to the heart, is not in an emotional way. The concept in Pascal is the concept of certainty that is connected to this sensitivity. When Pascal says that I know about what I have believed in, this certainty is the certainty of the heart. So a Cartesian concept is used, the one of certainty, to define the relationship he has with his faith. So there is the certainty of the faith in Pascal that is irreducible, that cannot be reduced to any form of sentimentalism. Thank you. Professor Esposito has often referred to a new form of nihilism, so to say, that is not the demolition of ancient values, rather it is an unprecedented lack of sense. It is a crisis that expresses a need. It can be expressed with existential malaise, but it expresses the cry, the expectation for fulfillment. Could you please help us better understand this crisis of the sense with respect to the certainty of the heart that Professor Carraud has just mentioned? Well, I would refer to what my colleague and especially my friend Vincent Carraud said about the heart, because I believe that even in nihilism, that is, even when a person, even without studying this phenomenon, may feel, may perceive it in their own life, there is a kind of lack of sense in the things of life. There must be a heart to become aware that there is no sense. So even before the crisis of values, of evidences, of significance, of ideals, it is not that everything is in crisis, because there needs to be someone who becomes aware of the crisis, and to do that, a heart is required in the first place. That's why I've always been interested in the fact that talking about nihilism doesn't mean that we've just lost some values, but it is a matter of recognizing that there is a crisis of the sense, of the meaning. And what does that mean? Normally, we consider these two terms, the sense, the meaning, the truth, that is the ultimate reason, even without theorizing about that, the ultimate reason why a person is on this earth, that for which a person looks at their children and pushes them to try not to die during their day. It is a sort of doctrine, an existential motivation. On the other hand, the crisis comes into place when all this seems to vanish, as there is no more certainty. But if we think about that, there is an intimate compenetration between sense and crisis. Rather, I would even dare to say that the crisis is the fabric of sense, because sense is not an ideology. It can be an ideology, but it's never an abstract belief, but it is looked at from inside the experience. In that way, the sense always manifests itself as a crisis. Let's think about it. Animals do not have issues about sense. A stone doesn't have really any question about the sense. The sense is a question that arises because somebody asks, why? Why has this happened? Why have I met you? Why this painful event? Why am I here in this world? And I, that I am, said the errant pastor of Leopardi's poem, and I that I am, so that I reason. So that question opens up a space of crisis, and whenever we acknowledge the sense of ourselves and of the world, a critical process always starts. And it is a sort of counter-movement with respect to the mechanisms of things. That's why, in my view, it is always interesting that the crisis as the loss of sense and the crisis as nature, the dynamic of the sense, can be considered together, the one with the other. That is to say that the loss of the evidence of sense is a formidable invitation, is an incredible invitation, and this is, in my view, the, I would say, fascinating character of any crisis. It sounds weird to say that because, of course, everybody would avoid a crisis at all levels: financial, economic, building, personal, psychological level. And yet, it is the crisis that gives space to our existence. And above all, it tells us that sense in order to show itself, it needs a free individual, a free subject. We always think about the sense of things as a necessary destiny. And sometimes we even call this kind of destiny God. And by God, drawing on Spinoza, we consider it a necessary order to which we have to abide by or we have to obey. Is something impenetrable. It's something that is necessary. In fact, in phenomenological terms, sense is always asking to be discovered, even for the faithful, the person who believes in God. So for the person for whom God is certainty, but even certainty asks to be always regained through a critical practice. In some sense, calls for freedom, calls for liberty. It calls for a subject able to recognize it. It doesn't exist the other way around. But let's make it clear. I'm not saying that the sense of things or the ultimate truth of the world depends on our freedom. It's much bigger than us. That's clear. And to use an ambiguous term, it is objective. And yet, such an objectivity, every time it occurs, must be acknowledged, must be recognized. A sense that is not recognized does not exist, basically. It doesn't depend on our own recognition. Let's make it clear. Sense is something that can be found in reality. But if one is not equipped with the right lenses, with the right eyes, and is not open to recognize it, sense just evaporates, fades away, and crystallizes just in a doctrine. That is why the crisis of sense is, so to say, the discrete flower of nihilism. Allow me to call it like that. It is the interesting side of a crisis because it helps us understand that sense awaits. Sense is there for somebody to become aware of it. It's just as if nihilism reformulated the issue of truth, the issue of the ultimate meaning of our presence in this world. It's not about whether there is or there is not a sense, but is it possible to become aware of it? Where can I become aware of it? With whom can I become aware of it?
Pour répondre à ce que tu viens de dire, ça me paraît très important en tant.
I'd like to add something here because listening to Professor Esposito, I must say it is important that you talk about sense and not only truth. So this is a very important point for the faithful. The truth is Christ himself. So the crisis related to the sense is not the same as the crisis related to the truth. This is a very important passage. And I'd like to go back to nihilism. Nihilism is the result of the fact that the self becomes the generator of values. So the designated objects are based on the valuation of the subject itself. This is why we have a crisis of the sense. So there are 2 centuries of nihilism, and we are at the beginning of 2 centuries of nihilism created by Nietzsche. But this concerns the concept of sense. So this is what I wanted to underline. So yes, I ask if I can say some something about this. We were talking about this last night too. One of the things that I found most interesting in Nietzsche, the most critical and dramatic aspect is not the famous death of God. God is dead. The values of the tradition are demolished. But rather, the immediate consequence of the fact that God has died is that the self has died. And the self has turned simply into someone who needs to define new values or to find self-realization. So this is the crisis we have today. So maybe there is a chance to understand again the two terms that we find in Pascal and in many other philosophers are the most interesting. God and the self. Do they still have a reference? And the consequence is also the opposition between the world and reality. So the world is what is criticized by the gospel, something that I don't like, I don't love, whereas reality is the element that we have to face in a way. Professor Carraud, I would like to ask you something about this tension, so to speak, the tension of the self, as you were saying, that can become the measure of everything, but that is constantly related to the infinite with a kind of constitutive disproportion. So, well, based on your experience, what can you tell us about this mystery of the self? Well, the mystery of the self is not the fact that it is related with this relationship with the infinite. The infinite is a metaphysical concept. The interest of Pascal, when he talks about the self, the I, is that this cannot be found metaphysically. It can only be found within the will, which is a synonym of freedom. So I go back to what my colleague was saying before, the fact that the will is our freedom, our will is our freedom. And this is where we have to look for the self as an object. So this means, in other words, that the self is no longer a principle, an evaluator of all of the values that are experiencing a crisis, and it can receive itself. So there is, in a way, a disappropriation. This is the fundamental concept for Pascal. So there is a comment to the letter to the Galatians when Pascal says that Christ lives in me, and I quote Father Giussani. I hope I can find what I'm looking for in the book.
Non, je ne le retrouve pas, mais enfin, la lettre aux Philippiens dit exactement comme la lettre aux Galates, c'est-à-dire que...
So, as I was saying, it says, I am inhabited by someone who's not me, and by an other, and this other is fundamental for Father Giussani. So I am, in a way, not the owner of myself. I am inhabited by an other. And this doesn't change the concept of truth, but rather the relationship between crisis and sense. But I'd like to ask now Professor Esposito, because you often talk about desire as our leading path for the sense. Often, thinking about what Professor Carraud was saying, the mystery is seen as an instinct or something that is subjective. So why do you think that this is, in a way, a road to sense? Well, going back to what my colleagues was saying, which was extremely interesting, the self, the I, is no longer the measure of the world, but rather something that is received and is inhabited by an other, by the other. My attention toward the desire is due to the fact that I think that this desire, you said that the main road, you talked about the main road, the leading road. This is the way by which we realize that we are someone else. The desire is, in a way, a phenomenon that attracts us. It is fascinating. If a man that does not have any desires is, well, close to death. Anyway, the desire is not only the lack of something. Well, that's a starting point in a way, because we tend to own. We want to own something that we think we're missing. And this phenomenon of the desire is extremely, it goes beyond our feelings. It's like an emptiness that shouts out. So philosophers says that desire is like a force that pushes me, vis a tergo, and I cannot take any decision. So this force pushes me towards a goal to fill this emptiness, this void. But the desire is more than this. It is a force which attracts me, which is in front of me. It is something erotic in a way. It's something that fascinates us, calls us, attracts us. And there are these two aspects of the desire that come together and make us appreciate our desire as the road to acknowledge the other. I know that desire is commonly something that is irrational, uncontrollable. It's something that goes beyond, something that is excessive, and sometimes something that scares us. So something that needs to be limited, channeled in. So what is irrational has to be brought back to reason, and the desire needs to be moralized. The desire pushes us, whereas reason stops us, in a way, manages us. But if we stop at this role play, we would lose both reason and desire. We need to free the desire, but not in the old-fashioned way of the 70s, of the sexual revolution. We need to reappropriate our bodies. It is a little bit old-fashioned in a way. And, well, to free our desire doesn't mean we can dance in the chaos. Because if that's what we see as a desire, this desire would burn us. The films by Pedro Almodovar show this. By desiring something, we actually destroy what we desire. So what do we mean by when we say that we need to free our desire? This is not an encouragement against morality. It simply means that we need to follow the logic of the desire, because the logic of the desire is that nothing is enough. Everything that we believe can be decisive in the lack we experience. It's an everyday life experience. Well, in the end, this is where we stop. When we are actually sorry for what we cannot achieve. And there are some words by Father Giussani on the words of Leopardi. The beauty of a woman is the promise of happiness, and then you're disappointed. So then you're resentful. And that's where we stop. But we need to free the desire, to liberate the desire. That means to understand the nature of our need. That is to say, the need to find the infinite. And Vincent, I know you can say that the infinite is a metaphysical concept, as Levinas would say, and Descartes as well in the third meditation. But we can use a different term, which is not infinite, but rather the acknowledgement of the other, because at the end, this is really the most important thing, that we are recognized, acknowledged by someone else who actually welcomes us in his eyes, in his gaze, and makes us understand the depth and the greatness of our desire. So this is what it means to free the desire as the leadway of the sense. No one can desire my desire, can have my desire, can desire something in my place. It is impossible, but we cannot make our desire real. So it is, in a way, an idea that we are in relationship to the other, but that this other already acts within ourselves in terms of uncertainty. I'd like to add a few words to your intervention, please.
En essayant de traduire ce que tu viens de dire, Pascal n'emploie pas le concept.
Pascal doesn't use the concept of desire, but rather he talks about the secondary role of the self. The self has second place. So, well, Pascal wonders, how can I love myself? And then he answers his own question by saying, I need to imagine a whole, and I am a part of this whole, and the love for the self, the love for myself, is the contrary to the love of the whole. So the whole loves the part, just like the love of God. The words of by Pascal on the hatred against the self can be understood only if we understand that if I love myself as a whole, the hand loves itself just as much as the body loves itself as a whole. So when the love for the self is not a principle, but as a whole, like God loves it. So this is what we find in a lot of works by Pascal. Les membres pensants. So there is a mixture, so to speak, of Saint Paul and Descartes. There is a double concept by Saint Paul and by Descartes. So this double approach by Pascal, what you call desire, is called by love for the self by Pascal. So it doesn't mean that we hate ourselves, but it means that we hate the love for the self as a form of principle, and to prefer a love of the self that is just. And if this doesn't happen, then the truth becomes an idol. And I'd like to quote Father Giussani. The truth becomes an idol. This means that the truth is an idol if it is separated from God. We need to love God as truth, but if I love the truth separated from God, the truth becomes an idol. So Pascal denounces metaphysics as the creation of an idol. The metaphysical demonstration of the existence of God lead to pride. If I want to reach God and prove God's existence, then this is my own merit, and this means that we fall into the trap of pride. This means that I can have access to God only through Jesus Christ, who is the mediator between me and God. So what you said about the desire can be seen in theological terms. Otherwise, the truth itself becomes an idol. I found the part that I wanted to quote, which is not in the religious sense, the senso religioso, but in another book, Il cammino al vero è un'esperienza. And, there's a quote of the letter to the Philippines. The Father Giussani writes, to exist means to be loved, and to definitely let yourself go to this love. This is my way to live God. In the next paragraph, we just have one sentence. The human existence is inexhaustible and almighty friendship. Well, we don't have almighty in the title of the meeting, but the sentence by Father Giussani has a meaning only in Christ. So the human existence in general, the existence of man, this is a friendship, this is an inexhaustible friendship, and therefore it is almighty. And that's the quote that I made before, giving a kind of justification for Christ. And, well, I would like to add that my work is based on the history of philosophy. Father Giussani had another kind of job. But if he knew the origin of the word existence, it was created in the 3rd century by someone you certainly are familiar with, Marius Victorinus, who invented this idea, this concept of existence. From St. Thomas to Kant, this X element is no longer there. So this X element is extremely important. X means coming from. And only Jesus Christ deserves that. Marius Victorinus lived a generation before St. Augustine, and therefore he was a professor of philosophy in Rome. He didn't want to say that, to reveal that he had converted to Christianity. In the Confessions by St. Augustine, we read, the walls make the church. And he says, I pray on my own. And then Marius Victorinus converted to show this X of the Christ, which has a collegiate meaning, because the existence in its that Father Giussani talks about in the Senso Religioso is the existence of God, of Christ. And this gives a meaning to the title of the meeting. The human existence is an inexhaustible and almighty friendship. So the existence of God is an inexhaustible friendship. It's not my existence.
Posso dire? No, interrompo ancora una volta la
I'm sorry to interrupt once again the chair because I'm so much interested in what my colleague is saying. So I'll try, but tell me if you agree. I'll try to translate into the post-nihilism problem this incredible question. It's an incredible question. What is the condition whereby I can love myself? I think this is the most burning question in our epoch, not just at the time of Pascal or Marius Victorinus. Because at a time like ours, it really seems that everybody glorifies themselves and everybody wants to make a performance of themselves. But in fact, the love to oneself is totally unknown because we love ourselves insofar as we fulfill what we have in our mind. But when we can't do that, we hate ourselves. And even the dimension, the Christian dimension, as Vincent referred to it, of existence, in my view, in our epoch, in our era, that I call post-nihilism. Well, all psychologists say now that all those forms of search for human glory are based on the hate towards oneself and not on the love towards oneself. Indeed, the Christ dimension in contemporary times, in the contemporary situation, can be understood because it is the only one that enables myself to embrace me, even if I am when I don't want to be, even when I fail. I love myself because I exist and I derive from that. And that's already a step towards or even beyond nihilism. I would like to thank you as I have some more little time, and Professor Carraud fulfilled one of my desires, that was talking about the title of the meeting. And I was impressed by your immediate reaction about the title, and you immediately said that's impossible. And you said, without Christ, it is impossible. And just after that, and we kept talking about it, and we went through again this passage by Giussani, where the title is taken from, which was already quoted by the professor. And I would like to mention it again to conclude and to thank you for the way that you have helped us understand it more and for sharing your research. Father Giussani says that the power of man is other with the uppercase letter, and the existence of man is other. Existence is a profound dialogue. Loneliness is abolished at the roots, at every time of life. Existence is being loved definitely. If I may, I'd like to go back to this point. I may do this myself or use Pascal's words, as you prefer. What you decide. Perhaps one should start from that disappropriation that I mentioned before. In the history of philosophy, perhaps Pascal is the last to understand that Christ is the Word, and the Word speaks to him. That's an experience of Christ. Christ himself as experience. After Pascal, all philosophers will talk about Christ as a concept. So Kant, and after Pascal and before him St. Augustine, use the concept of Word of God as the Word. And Christ as a mediator is seen in a way that I don't experience Christ, but Christ as such has the value of experience. That's why he's the unique mediator. If I want to have access to God, so well beyond my pride, I have to go through Christ. So Pope Francis, in his letter, talks about having access to Christ as the one who enables me to find my misery and my greatness at the same time. I may continue on this point. For Pascal, man is twofold. Man is great and is miserable at the same time. This is the answer to the Socratic question, know yourself. All philosophers say that either man is great as the Stoics or miserable as skeptics. Just with Pascal instead and the Gospel, we are told that man is both great and miserable. And the Pope emphasized this in his letter, this double nature of man, both great and miserable at the same time. And Pascal describes it as a contradiction. That is a contradiction which is unthinkable, but that is implemented in what he calls the man God. So there is greatness and misery together. The experience of Christ, therefore, is an experience of my greatness and at the same time of my misery. That's connected to what I was saying before about the self and the fact that Christ lives in me. This point you have mentioned is really interesting, that is the experience of Christ. That's correct. Christ is not the object of experience. It is himself, the sense of experience, and not something as an object among others that may make its way in our conscience. But when you said now the experience of Christ normally coincides with the experience that we make of ourselves, of our own misery, of our own nothing, and of our greatness. This was not prepared, I have to say, but again, we see that we find this idea of trying to give meaning again to the word God only if we give meaning to the word I. So the possibility of keeping them together, this is the good old Catholic theology. Christ is the mediator. And this used to be studied in catechism, that Christ is the mediator, but rediscovering it in the logic of experience, that is, he is mediator because he enables me to love myself by loving my destiny. And this is also extremely interesting. When we say the word destiny or God, as I said before, it has to do with something that keeps our hands cuffed. But when we think about Christ, we have the sense of liberty, of history. So this Christ mediation, as Vincent Carraud said before, is the one that makes it possible, and I'm doing this on purpose, not just to pay tribute to the title, I would have said it anyway, to understand that there is a friendship between destiny and liberty. That is, liberty, freedom, is not just a more or less finite attempt to express oneself. Freedom has to do with destiny, but be careful. It's not that freedom has to get to destiny, as if freedom were something dangerous and slippery. Freedom must be purified to get to God. Rather, freedom can be itself as it recognizes God. And how does it recognize God? Because it recognizes that it is loved. And this self-love, loving oneself, but not in a selfish or self-referential manner. I love myself as intuitively and analogically I discover that I am loved by God. As was mentioned before, this sense of belonging to a whole and not just to a part that wants to affirm itself. And from this point of view, I think that what Professor Vincent Carraud said is really interesting. If I got it correctly, philosopher Pascal helps us understand the certainty of faith in modernity, as we tend to think that modernity, according to a certain image or historiography, is the loss of faith, because what emerges is just a man that is the measure of himself. But in fact, there is somebody like Pascal, and if I may, many of us have rediscovered this through the experience and through the charisma of Father Giussani. The certainty of faith is the most modern thing ever. It is when the self becomes aware of the whole spectrum of its possibilities, of its misery and of its greatness. And I think I understand, but please correct me if I'm wrong, because you are the expert of Pascal. So this is not a dialectic. On the one hand, we are limited. On the other hand, not. That's the way that we think about ourselves in terms of cycles. Either we believe to be the masters of the world, or when things go wrong, we get depressed. Either we get excited or we get depressed. There, on the other hand, there is a relationship, and those two sides stick together. So our finiteness is blessed, our nothing is blessed, because it is the possibility to become aware of the greatness that we are. I think this is a formidable modernity of faith. The experience of the faith is not pre-modern, it is meta-modern. Absolutely. Just allow me to make a couple of remarks on what you have said. First, I mentioned Christ as a mediator between me and God, and there is an extraordinary letter written by Pascal when his father dies, where he said that Christ is the mediator between Christ and myself, and it's the mediator between me and God. Because Christ gets access to me through God, through Christ. It's a metaphysical thought, so it puts the infinite into brackets, so to say, and we go back to the discovery of the infinite through Pascal. And then I would like to go back to the theme of the mythic friendship from Aristotle. The concept of friendship has always had the I as a founding principle. In a rigorous sense, the friendship is linked to the self. Aristotle says the one that has more merits has a lot of friends who have fewer merits. So the principle of friendship is based on the principle of merit. So I like the other as much as I love myself. So according to Aristotle, women always have fewer merits than men. And so men loves less women than women love men. And the Greeks have a different sense of friendship from ours. Philein, that's what they said. And philein also means to love, in the sense of love and friendship. If we don't understand this, we can't understand why Christ says, I don't call you my servants, but friends, because it is the doctrine of love that is at stake here. Because for Christ, loving someone means to be ready to die for them. That's the fundamental point. Loving for someone means being ready to die for that person. And sometimes we forget about this, but Father Giussani doesn't forget about that when he talks about friendship. Friendship is always mutual and it's always equal. It's based on an equal relationship. But if we read the Gospel correctly, the philein is not an equal relationship. The one who loves is the one who is ready to die for the other. This is a fundamental point that makes the Gospel different from all ancient philosophy. So the philia or philia mentioned by God is always more than the reciprocal equity of friendship. And going back to what was said about truth, friendship modifies the concept of truth. In the whole of history until Descartes is defined as adjustment. Truth is adjustment. So adjustment also means equality, that is what I think is equal to reality. And that's what I state, what I assume. So when I say that something is true, I think that there is an equal relationship between the truth and what I say. And with the issue of certainty, the memoir of certainty, Pascal mentions a couple of times that there is this possibility of having an act of the thought in terms of understanding and also an act of freedom, of will. So you are right when the relationship between certainty and faith is a postmodern relationship and not an ancient one, or meta-modern relationship even.
Vorrei dire solamente una cosa brevissima, anche perché
I would just like to add something. I was actually impressed when Vincent, reading the title, said an inexhaustible friendship is impossible for human beings, because we are human. We all know that. It is enough to take into account our personal experience, unless we take into account the man that is Christ, that is God. But I do believe that this makes it difficult for everyone to understand, because it means that, and this is how I read the relationship between misery and greatness, that we are capable of what is impossible. In the Middle Ages, people said homo capax Dei, but to be capable of the impossible, meaning that this capability was not a performance, actually. It's when we, just like a capacity to contain, to host in ourselves what is impossible, because that's what we're made of, because we exist, because we were born, because someone wanted us to be born. So our capacity is to welcome this gift, to welcome what is impossible. That is to say, an inexhaustible, and we can now complete the title, but also almighty friendship. Well, not for us, not because we want to be powerful, but because someone actually managed to fight against death.
Je peux prendre un exemple de ce que
I would like to make an example of what you just said. What is impossible, actually? Well, to love our enemies, like Matthew says, well, that seems impossible, because if we love our enemies, they're no longer enemies, they're friends. So we need to be careful. In Latin, just like in French and Italian, we have the word amicus and then the word inimicus. But in Greek, in the Philein vocabulary, there is someone I love, but there is another way, another word to say enemy. So the enemy is not the contrary of a friend, just like in English. So to love one's enemies doesn't mean to love someone who is our inimicus. And I just give you a very simple example. At the end of the Gospel by St. Luke, there is a very famous episode, that of the good thief and the evil thief. So Jesus Christ tells the good thief, tonight you'll be with me in heaven. But in reality, for all religions, including the Jewish religion of the Old Testament, because as St. Paul says to his letter to the Romans, our consciousness is our religion, so the good thief is always saved. And the day of the final judgment, he will be saved because he repented when he was about to die, and he acknowledged Christ as the Son of God. So actually, he didn't need, so to speak, Christ, because by repenting, he was granted to be saved. So for whom does Christ die? For the evil thief, because only Christ's death can save the evil thief. That is what love your enemies mean. The evil thief does not acknowledge the authority of Christ, but Christ dies for him. So he doesn't die for the good thief who would be saved anyway, but he dies for the evil one. And I do believe this is the best example of what we mean by loving your enemies. We need to understand that in the quote of the title of the meeting, friendship means philia. So all the forms of love not only what we call the friendship, a mutual relationship, a mutual friendship that has the I, the self, as a principle.
Io vi ringrazio.
I would like to thank you, really, again, for this meeting and for this dialogue that is a great contribution to our human path. Thank you again. I would like to remind you that all of you can contribute to the creation and of a meeting place like the Rimini meeting. So donate now. You have all the stands with the red heart on the fairgrounds. Thanks again.
Ce n'est pas du tout ce qui était prévu, ce n'est pas du tout ce qui était prévu en fait. Rien de ce qui était prévu. Merci, merci. Mais ce n'est pas ce qui était prévu, mais c'est à cause de Costantino qui a démarré sur autre chose. Donc j'ai essayé de répondre, donc c'est voilà.
La civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Il senso religioso o l'esperienza religiosa è innanzitutto un fatto, un fenomeno obiettivo, un fatto reale, non è un'idea, innanzitutto non è un modo di sentire, non solo si tratta di un fatto, di un avvenimento, ma del fatto più imponente e più inestirpabile della storia dell'uomo. Più imponente, più vasto, che neanche il fenomeno dell'amore dell'uomo e della donna, che neanche il fenomeno del rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perché il senso religioso è un avvenimento che pone, che afferma o che ricerca l'orizzonte entro il quale acquisti senso anche il rapporto tra l'uomo e la donna, anche il rapporto tra genitori e figli. Perciò è più vasto, perfino di quelli